The woman lay in bed with her back to the CEO on the first night of their whirlwind marriage. There was enough space between them for another person to sleep. However, when she woke up the next morning, she was shocked to find herself sleeping in his arms. The woman was instantly so embarrassed that she barely dared to breathe. She assumed that she must have moved around too much in her sleep, so the following night, she deliberately stayed even farther away from the CEO. However, she had no idea that every time she fell into a deep sleep, the CEO would secretly pull her into his arms before finally falling asleep with complete satisfaction. Because their marriage had been arranged by their families and had happened so quickly, the woman had been avoiding the relationship. In fact, the CEO had fallen in love with her at first sight during their matchmaking meeting. She sat across from him, looking quiet and well-behaved on the surface, yet beneath the table, she nervously picked at her fingers the entire time, revealing just how anxious and uneasy she truly felt. It turned out that the person who was originally supposed to be sitting across from the CEO that day was her older sister. But her sister refused to accept the arranged marriage and fled abroad. So the woman, the younger daughter who had been abandoned in the countryside by her parents when she was little and raised by her grandparents, was forced to take her sister's place at the matchmaking meeting. The CEO sitting across from her was exactly the kind of wealthy and powerful man any family would want as a son-in-law. Unlike her older sister, who had always stood out and drawn attention since childhood, the woman believed that an ugly duckling like her could never win the CEO's favor. She assumed that she was only there to go through the motions and that everything would be over once the matchmaking meeting ended. But after the matchmaking meeting, the woman's parents immediately asked the CEO what he thought of their daughter. The CEO glanced at the woman inside the room and casually said, "She's not bad. For a CEO with such impossibly high standards, that was already an extremely high compliment." Her parents immediately beamed with joy, believing that their daughter already had one foot in the door of one of the country's wealthiest families. The woman had no idea what the CEO, whose fortune was worth hundreds of billions, was thinking. The very next day, before she even had time to process any of it, she somehow found herself walking out of the marriage registry with him, holding their marriage certificate in her hand. The CEO then handed her a large diamond ring. The woman was startled and said it was far too expensive. But the CEO calmly asked, "Are you saying my wife isn't worthy of this ring?" It turned out that because this was an arranged marriage between their families, the woman had never expected any romantic gestures or ceremony. However, she noticed that the CEO had already placed a wedding ring on his own ring finger without needing to be asked. If she refused his ring now, she would only seem overly difficult. At that moment, the CEO told her to move into his home as soon as possible. The woman felt that everything was moving far too quickly and began to hesitate. However, the CEO calmly asked, "So you plan to be my wife in name only and live apart from me forever?" The woman felt that since she had already become his wife, perhaps she should at least try to accept her new identity. She told him that she would move in as soon as possible. However, only a few days after their marriage, the CEO left on a business trip that lasted an entire month. During that month, the woman's life was almost exactly the same as it had been before the marriage, except that she had moved into the CEO's enormous villa, which covered several thousand square feet. At the company, she was only an intern and was constantly given a hard time by her supervisor. However, she never complained. Her parents had never cared about her, so she had long grown accustomed to handling everything on her own.